January 17, 1945, Northern Germany. The Ruhr pocket. The snow fell in sheets that morning, thick and silent, muffling the world beneath a white shroud. The temperature had plunged to 12 degrees below zero. Frost clung to the skeletal branches of birch trees lining the frozen road, their bark blackened by years of war. In the distance, the low rumble of Allied tanks punctuated the stillness. A mechanical heartbeat advancing through the wasteland of the Third Reich, along a muddy track turned to ice. A column of German prisoners shuffled westward, their breath rising in pale clouds, their boots crunching against the hardened snow. They moved without speaking, without hope, their faces gray and hollow beneath the brims of tattered Wehrmacht caps. Among them, hunched and shivering, were not only soldiers but civilians caught in the collapse of a regime that had promised them eternity. The war had turned. What had begun with triumphant parades through the streets of Berlin, with flags and cheers and the intoxicating rhetoric of invincibility, had devolved into this, a slow, frozen march into captivity. The soldiers who had once sung of a 1,000-year Reich now trudged in silence, their eyes fixed on the ground, their minds haunted by the certainty that everything they had believed was a lie. And among them, barely visible in the mass of gray uniforms and gaunt faces, was an elderly woman, her frail body wrapped in layers of threadbare wool, her hands bound by cold and exhaustion. She could no longer walk. The Canadian soldiers escorting the column had seen many things by this point in the war. They had witnessed the brutality of Normandy, the fields littered with the broken bodies of friends and enemies alike. They had liberated villages where emaciated civilians emerged from cellars, blinking in disbelief at the sight of freedom. They had learned to distinguish between fanaticism and desperation, between those who still clung to Hitler's dream and those who had simply been swept along by the tide of history. And on this frozen morning, they saw the old woman collapse. She fell without a sound, crumpling into the snow as if her body had simply given out, as if the weight of the world had finally become too much to bear. The column halted. For a moment, no one moved. The German prisoners glanced at one another, their faces betraying nothing, neither pity nor anger, only the dull resignation of men and women who had seen too much suffering to be surprised by it anymore. The woman lay still, her breath shallow, her eyes half closed. She was dying, and everyone knew it. Then, without a word, 2 Canadian soldiers stepped forward. They were young men, no older than 25, their uniforms stained with mud and soot, their faces hardened by months of combat. They knelt beside the woman, their movements careful, almost tender. One of them slipped his arms beneath her shoulders, the other beneath her knees, and together they lifted her from the snow. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and wool, her body limp and unresisting. They carried her forward, cradling her as one might carry a child, and the column resumed its march. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the line, a voice cried out, "Das ist mein Mutter." That's my mother. The words rang out across the frozen landscape, sharp and raw, cutting through the silence like a blade. The column stopped again. Heads turned. Eyes searched. And from among the mass of prisoners, a woman pushed her way forward, stumbling over the uneven ground, her face contorted with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She was younger than the woman being carried, perhaps in her early 40s, her hair streaked with gray, her cheeks sunken from months of hunger. She wore the remnants of a civilian coat over a soiled dress, and her hands, bare and red with cold, reached out toward the Canadians as if pleading with them to stop. "Das ist mein Mutter," she cried again, her voice breaking. "That's my mother." To understand this moment, one must step back into the machinery of war that had ground Germany into dust by the winter of 1945. The Ruhr pocket, a sprawling industrial region in the heart of Western Germany, had become a trap for nearly 300,000 German soldiers and countless civilians. Encircled by Allied forces in early April, The pocket represented the last gasp of Nazi resistance in the West. Field Marshal Walter Model, a loyal servant of the Führer, commanded the defense, ordering his men to hold the line even as supplies dwindled and hope evaporated. By mid-January, the civilians caught within the pocket had become collateral damage in a conflict they could no longer control. They had been told for years that victory was assured, that Germany's enemies would be crushed beneath the iron heel of the Wehrmacht. They had been told that sacrifice was noble, that suffering was temporary, that the Reich would endure forever. Now as the snow fell and the Allied guns thundered, they learned the truth. They had been abandoned. The woman lying in the arms of the Canadian soldiers was one of thousands who had clung to survival in the ruins of the Reich. She had lived through the bombings, the shortages, the slow disintegration of a society that had once prided itself on order and strength. She had watched her neighbors disappear, dragged away by the Gestapo for crimes real or imagined. She had endured the winter cold without coal, the hunger without bread, the loneliness without hope. And when the Allies finally came, she had been swept up in the chaos of retreat, herded along with soldiers and refugees alike, her identity reduced to that of a nameless prisoner. She had expected nothing from her captors. She had been told they were barbarians, that they would show no mercy, that capture meant death or worse. But when she fell, they lifted her. When she could no longer walk, they carried her. Her daughter had not expected this either. She had been separated from her mother weeks earlier, lost in the confusion of the collapsing front. She had searched for her among the columns of refugees, shouting her name into the wind, but the snow and the smoke had swallowed her voice. She had resigned herself to the possibility that her mother was dead, buried beneath the rubble of a bombed-out town or frozen in a ditch somewhere along the endless road. And yet here she was, alive, cradled in the arms of enemy soldiers, her face pale but peaceful, her eyes closed as if in sleep. The daughter's cry had shattered the fragile anonymity of the march. She stood before the Canadians now, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with desperation. She did not know what to say. She did not know if they would understand her, if they would care, if they would simply push her aside and continue on. But she could not remain silent. That was her mother. That was the woman who had held her as a child, who had sung her to sleep in better days, who had survived everything the war had thrown at them only to collapse here. In the snow, in the hands of strangers, one of the Canadian soldiers looked at her. He was a tall man with a square jaw and tired eyes, his uniform marked by the insignia of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. He had seen enough of the war to recognize desperation when he saw it. He nodded slowly, then gestured for the daughter to come closer. She hesitated, then stepped forward, her hands trembling. The soldier lowered the old woman gently into her daughter's arms, transferring the weight with a care that seemed almost impossible given the context of war. The daughter clutched her mother to her chest, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with silent sobs. The old woman's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she seemed to recognize the face above her. She whispered something, a single word, too quiet for anyone else to hear. Then her eyes closed again. This was not the war the Germans had been promised. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, he had spoken of destiny, of reclaiming Germany's rightful place among the great powers of the world. He had promised jobs, stability, and pride to a nation humiliated by defeat in the First World War. He had promised Lebensraum, living space for the German people, carved from the territories of the Slavic nations to the east. He had promised victory, and for a time, it seemed as though his promises would be fulfilled. The Wehrmacht had swept across Europe with terrifying efficiency, crushing Poland in weeks, France in months, the Balkans in days. German soldiers had marched into Paris, had stood before the Eiffel Tower, had written letters home describing their triumphs in glowing terms. They had believed they were invincible. "That's my mother." The words rang out across the frozen landscape, sharp and raw, cutting through the silence like a blade. The column stopped again. Heads turned. Eyes searched. And from among the mass of prisoners, a woman pushed her way forward, stumbling over the uneven ground, her face contorted with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She was younger than the woman being carried, perhaps in her early 40s, her hair streaked with gray, her cheeks sunken from months of hunger. She wore the remnants of a civilian coat over a soiled dress, and her hands, bare and red with cold, reached out toward the Canadians as if pleading with them to stop. But invincibility is a fragile illusion, and by 1945, it had shattered completely. The German soldiers shuffling through the snow that January morning had learned what their leaders had refused to tell them, that wars are not won by rhetoric alone, that ideology cannot stop bullets, that even the mightiest empire can crumble when the world unites against it. They had expected glory. They had received mud, blood, and frostbite. They had expected honor. They had received orders to hold positions that could not be held, to fight battles that could not be won, to die for a cause that had long since lost any meaning. And now, as prisoners, they were learning something else entirely. They were learning that the enemy they had been taught to fear, the Canadians, the Americans, the British, were not the monsters their propaganda had described. They were men who carried old women through the snow. The Canadian soldiers, escorting the column, were products of a different world. They had grown up in a democracy, in a society where dissent was tolerated, where leaders were questioned, where the individual mattered. They had volunteered or been drafted into a war they understood not as a quest for empire, but as a struggle against tyranny. They had been taught that the enemy was not the German people, but the ideology that had enslaved them. They had been taught to show mercy when mercy was possible, to uphold the rules of war, even when their enemies did not. And so when an old woman fell, they did not leave her to die. They picked her up. They carried her. They did not see her as a burden or a symbol of the enemy's weakness. They saw her as a human being. This contrast between what the Germans had expected and what they experienced was a recurring theme in the closing months of the war. Captured German soldiers often expressed shock at the treatment they received from their captors. They had been told that Allied prisoners would be beaten, starved, or executed. Instead, they found themselves given food, medical care, and shelter. They had been told that the Allies were barbarians bent on the destruction of the German race. Instead, they encountered men who shared cigarettes, who spoke kindly, who treated them with a dignity their own leaders had long since abandoned. This was not weakness. It was strength of a different kind, rooted not in domination, but in principle. It was the strength of a society that valued human life, even the lives of its enemies. The symbolic weight of that moment, the old woman carried through the snow, cannot be overstated. Snow, throughout history, has been associated with both death and purity. It covers the world in silence, transforming the landscape into something both beautiful and treacherous. In the context of war, snow is an equalizer. It does not distinguish between victor and vanquished, between soldier and civilian. It falls on all alike, and it kills all alike if they are not careful. But snow also preserves. It can bury the dead, yes, but it can also protect the living, insulating them against the harsher elements of wind and cold. In this moment, the snow was both a threat and a witness. It threatened to bury the old woman, to claim her as one more casualty in a war that had already claimed millions. But it also bore witness to an act of mercy, preserving the memory of the Canadian soldier's kindness in the frozen stillness of that January morning. The old woman herself became a symbol. She represented the German people, stripped of their illusions, reduced to their most vulnerable state, dependent on the mercy of those they had been taught to hate. She was not a Nazi ideologue. She was not a war criminal. She was simply a mother, a grandmother, a human being caught in the machinery of history. Her collapse in the snow was the collapse of the Reich itself, its strength sapped, its promises broken, its people left to the mercy of a world it had tried to conquer. And the hands that lifted her, the hands of the Canadian soldiers, represented a different vision of power, one rooted not in domination but in compassion. Her daughter, too, became a symbol. Her cry, "Das ist mein Mutter," was the cry of a generation that had lost everything, that had been torn apart by war, that had searched for loved ones among the rubble and the snow and the endless columns of the displaced. Her recognition of her mother in that moment was a small miracle, a flicker of light in the darkness. It was a reminder that even in the midst of total war, even in the chaos of a collapsing regime, the bonds of family endure. Love endures. Humanity endures. "That's my mother." The words rang out across the frozen landscape, sharp and raw, cutting through the silence like a blade. The column stopped again. Heads turned. Eyes searched. And from among the mass of prisoners, a woman pushed her way forward, stumbling over the uneven ground, her face contorted with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She was younger than the woman being carried, perhaps in her early 40s, her hair streaked with gray, her cheeks sunken from months of hunger. She wore the remnants of a civilian coat over a soiled dress, and her hands, bare and red with cold, reached out toward the Canadians as if pleading with them to stop. Historical records from the winter of 1945 provide a stark picture of the conditions faced by German prisoners and civilians. A report by the Canadian First Army documented that temperatures in the Ruhr region dropped as low as -15 degrees Celsius in mid-January. Frostbite cases among German prisoners skyrocketed, with Allied medical units treating thousands for severe cold injuries. Food supplies for the German population had collapsed. Rationing, which had been strict since 1942, became almost meaningless as supply lines were severed and stockpiles exhausted. Civilians subsisted on whatever they could scavenge: frozen potatoes dug from the ground, bread made from sawdust and flour substitutes, soup boiled from bones and scraps. The old and the very young were the first to suffer. Mortality rates among the elderly climbed steeply, particularly among those displaced by the fighting. Yet amid this suffering, acts of compassion emerged. Canadian, British, and American soldiers frequently shared their rations with German prisoners, despite regulations discouraging such behavior. One Canadian medic, interviewed years later, recalled treating a German woman suffering from pneumonia. "She looked at me like I was going to shoot her," he said. "I gave her a blanket and some hot soup. She cried. I don't think she expected us to treat her like a person." This pattern repeated itself across the front. The Allies, products of societies that valued individual dignity and the rule of law, found it difficult to ignore the suffering of those who had been their enemies. They had been taught to hate the Nazi regime, but they could not hate the frightened, starving people caught in its collapse. For the Germans, this experience was transformative. Many prisoners later testified that their treatment at the hands of the Allies shattered their belief in Nazi propaganda. They had been told that the Western democracies were weak, decadent, incapable of sustaining a prolonged conflict. They had been told that Allied soldiers were cowards, that they relied on superior numbers and equipment rather than courage. What they discovered was the opposite. Allied soldiers were disciplined, professional, and most surprising of all, humane. This revelation did not come easily. Years of indoctrination could not be erased overnight. But in small moments, a shared cigarette, a blanket given to a freezing prisoner, an old woman carried through the snow, the lies began to crumble. The daughter held her mother for a long time, kneeling in the snow, oblivious to the cold, oblivious to the column of prisoners waiting to move on. The Canadian soldiers stood nearby, silent, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their breath rising in clouds. They did not rush her. They did not shout at her to hurry. They simply waited, allowing her this moment of reunion, this fragile grace in the midst of chaos. Around them, the other prisoners watched, their faces betraying nothing, but their eyes revealing everything. Some looked away, unwilling to witness the raw emotion of the scene. Others stared, transfixed, as if the sight of the mother and daughter reminded them of their own families, their own losses, their own desperate hopes for reunion. Eventually, the daughter looked up at the Canadian soldier who had carried her mother. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her eyes said everything. They said, "Thank you." They said, "I did not expect this." They said, "You are not what I was told you were." The soldier nodded, then reached down and helped her to her feet. He gestured for another prisoner, a young man who still had some strength left, to assist in carrying the old woman. Together, the daughter and the young soldier fashioned a makeshift stretcher from a blanket, and they placed the old woman on it. The column resumed its march, but something had shifted. The prisoners no longer walked in complete silence. Whispers passed among them, quiet but insistent. They had seen something they could not reconcile with what they had been taught. They had seen mercy. They had seen humanity. And in that moment, the ideology that had sustained them, or at least that they had been forced to accept, began to lose its grip. This was the power of the small act, the quiet gesture. It did not change the course of the war. It did not alter the strategic balance. But it changed the people who witnessed it. It planted a seed of doubt in the minds of those who had believed the lies, and it affirmed the principles of those who had carried the old woman through the snow. The war ended 3 months later. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally, and the Third Reich ceased to exist. The soldiers and civilians who had marched through the snow that January morning were scattered across prisoner-of-war camps, displaced persons camps, and the ruins of their former homes. Some returned to families that had survived. Others found only graves and rubble. The old woman, according to fragmentary records, survived her ordeal. She was treated by Allied medical personnel and eventually reunited with her daughter in a refugee camp near the Dutch border. They were among the lucky ones. The Canadian soldiers who had carried her returned home to a world that was beginning the long process of rebuilding. They did not speak much about what they had done. It had seemed, at the time, like nothing, just an act of basic decency in a world gone mad. But years later, some of them would remember that moment. They would remember the weight of the old woman in their arms, the cry of her daughter, the silence of the snow. They would remember it because it had meant something, not in the grand sweep of history, but in the quiet, personal sense of doing what was right. What does it mean to carry an enemy through the snow? It means recognizing that the labels we place on one another, enemy, ally, friend, foe, are temporary, contingent, subject to change. It means understanding that beneath the uniform, beneath the flag, beneath the ideology, there is a human being who bleeds, who suffers, who loves and mourns and hopes just as we do. The Canadians who carried the old woman did not do so because they believed in the German cause. They did not do so because they thought her innocent or because they forgave the crimes of the regime she had lived under. They did so because in that moment, she was not a German or a Nazi or an enemy. She was a dying woman in need of help. And they had the power to give it. This, perhaps, is the essence of what separates democracy from tyranny, freedom from oppression. Democracies are not perfect. They make mistakes. They wage wars, sometimes unjust ones. But at their core, they are built on the principle that every individual has worth, that every life matters, that power must be tempered by compassion. Tyrannies, by contrast, are built on the principle that some lives matter more than others, that the individual exists only to serve the state, that mercy is weakness. The old woman in the snow was a casualty of tyranny. The soldiers who carried her were the product of democracy. That difference, small and quiet as it was in that frozen moment, was everything. Imagine, if you will, the last thing the old woman saw before her eyes closed in the arms of the Canadians. Imagine the snowflakes falling, drifting down from a gray sky. Each one unique, each one fragile, each one melting the moment it touched her skin. Imagine the faces of the soldiers, young and weary, their breath misting in the cold, their expressions serious but not cruel. Imagine the sound of boots crunching on snow, the distant rumble of war, the whisper of wind through the trees. And imagine the feeling, perhaps, of relief. Relief that the end, whatever it might be, would come with some measure of kindness. That she would not die alone in the snow, anonymous and forgotten, but would be carried, held, cared for, even if only for a little while. That is what the Canadians gave her. Not victory, not justice, not even safety, not really, but something more fundamental. They gave her dignity. They gave her humanity. They gave her, in her final moments of strength, the knowledge that she mattered. And her daughter, crying out in the snow, gave the world something too. She gave it a reminder that love does not end, that families can be found even in the midst of chaos, that a single voice can cut through the silence of war and claim what is hers. Das ist mein Mutter. That's my mother. Not a prisoner, not a casualty, not a statistic. My mother. The snow continued to fall that day, long after the column had moved on. It covered the tracks they had left behind, smoothing the ground, erasing the evidence of their passage. But the memory remained. It remained in the minds of those who had witnessed it, in the stories they would tell, in the quiet knowledge that even in the darkest hours of human history, there is room for grace. The war had taken so much from so many. It had destroyed cities, shattered families, killed millions. But it had not destroyed everything. It had not destroyed the impulse to help a stranger, to lift someone who had fallen, to show mercy when mercy was not required. This is what we remember when we remember that moment in the snow. We remember that the old woman was carried. We remember that her daughter found her. We remember that in the midst of a war that sought to reduce humanity to its most brutal instincts, two young soldiers chose to be kind. And in that choice, small and fleeting though it was, they affirmed something larger than themselves, something larger than the war, something larger even than the ideologies that had brought the world to the brink of destruction. They affirmed the simple, enduring truth that we are, all of us, worthy of care. That we are, all of us, someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's child. That the snow falls on us all, and when we fall, we hope against all reason, against all odds that someone will lift us up. That is the legacy of that frozen morning in January 1945. That is the story of the woman in the snow. And that is why, even now 80 years later, we tell it still.